Hey students, welcome back. This is Spanish 2, Lecture 3 for week 2, and we are finishing up the material for Episodio 8. Okay, so here are some sentence and question formation vocabulary that I will use or you might see or hear in videos from me. So in sentence in Spanish is oración, and sentences in plural is oraciones. Question is pregunta, and questions is preguntas. And I'm going to explain really quick that we have two types of questions, and this both applies to English and Spanish. And we have closed questions and open questions. Closed questions are questions that you answer with yes or no. And these are questions that we use to confirm information. For example, do you like ice cream? Or is the library on the 6th floor? So usually someone would just confirm or deny that the information is correct. Then we have open questions, which are WH questions. And these are questions that, would use the words like where, what, when, how. And we use these questions to find out more information. For example, where is the library? That's going to give me a little bit more than a yes and a no for an answer. Other important Spanish question vocabulary is these words, and these are going to be vocabulary that we use for the open questions in Spanish. So, ¿dónde is where? ¿A dónde is to where? ¿Cuántas veces? How many times? And this we can use with how many times a week, how many times a month. So you need to learn those as well. ¿Con qué frecuencia? How often? And ¿cuándo is when? Okay, so I created this illustration so you kind of see how the vocabulary is very related from sentences to questions. And also, if you are able to write a subject-verb sentence like the ones in the previous lecture, these question formation should be very easy for you. So I have this ladder here that just kind of shows the grammar similarities. So I have sentence. I read the news every day. Okay, notice that I have I read in yellow, and when you go to Spanish, the Spanish translation of this would be yo leo las noticias todos los días. So I read becomes yo leo, right? Very simple. Everything else is kind of direct translation. Okay, so closed question. A closed question for this would be, do you read the news every day? Notice that do you read is 3 words. And in Spanish, we only use lees. Lees las noticias todos los días. And that is because in Spanish, we don't have the do verb. And when we conjugate the verb, you read, it becomes this. So we are basically substituting 3 English words for 1 Spanish conjugated verb. And the open question, we have the WH phrase, how often? ¿Con qué frecuencia? And then again, do you read? Lees, it substitutes 3 words here. So how often, con qué frecuencia, do you read, lees the news, las noticias? I'm going to explain these steps more deeply in the next slides. Okay, so for do you questions or closed questions, here's some important notes you should know. First, English uses the verb do to show the present tense for questions. In Spanish, we do not use a helping verb at all. So just because you see do you in English, it doesn't mean you need to write another verb in Spanish. Another thing is that in English, we always mention the subject, who is doing the action, because if we don't, then our sentences or questions wouldn't make much sense. However, in Spanish, as you have noticed, when we conjugate a verb, the endings are different for each subject. So the verb tells me who is doing the action. So this really helps out because a lot of times in Spanish, or you will hear Spanish speakers only use vives, vive, vivimos, not saying who is doing the action since they feel since the verb itself expresses that. So here's one example. Let's translate the question, do you live with your family? So Remember, do you live? So we don't use the verb do in Spanish. You live, we would use tú vives. So we're going to take vives and kind of start our question here. So, do you live and then with your family? Vives con tu familia? So that's pretty simple. Go ahead and look at the chart and write these questions down. Ask your teacher if she lives in Chicago. This should be a formal usted, a you. And also ask all of your classmates if they live near Kendall. So go ahead and pause the video and start the video again when you have come up with these questions. Okay, and I'm gonna guess that you finished these questions. You should have used vive for the teacher question and viven for the classmates question. Let's look at the answers. Okay, to ask your teacher if she lives in Chicago, you should have written vive en Chicago. And for the classmates question, you should have written something like viven cerca de Kendall. The most important thing here is the verb, and it's okay if you might have missed they or en here and there. Those are difficult prepositions, but make sure you have your verbs there. Okay, so if you want to practice more do you questions, you can go to page 177 of the textbook and you can work with this chart. Notice that this chart has these verbs conjugated in he or she form, so you will have to conjugate them to you to practice writing do you questions. Also, you can practice writing answers to these questions as if someone was asking you these questions. So this is a really good practice for you to not only practice the question formation, but also your sentence structure. Okay, so now let's talk about open questions, and this is the extra step. So here's an important note. As I mentioned earlier, in English, we use who, what, when, where, how, and why to write open questions. And Spanish uses very similar words, so you should definitely know what the meaning of those WH question words are in Spanish. And there's pretty much a similar pattern from English to Spanish. So if you're able to form closed questions, you can definitely form open questions. So this is what I would say. To create an open question, you have to be able to write a closed question and add the WH phrase. So let's talk about this question. How often do you eat pizza? I broke it down in two aspects. How often is the open question phrase, con qué frecuencia, and then the closed question is, do you eat pizza? So in Spanish, it's pretty much the same. Con qué frecuencia comes, right? Do you eat pizza? And here's another one. How many times a week do they eat in a restaurant? So here is ¿cuántas veces a la semana comen? Because do they eat, conjugation, en un restaurante. And that's it. Here are some important irregular verbs for location that you will be using to write and answer open-ended questions. Talking about location. So we have the verb estar, verbo estar, which is irregular, and that means to be in English. And we have the verb ir, which means, in this case, to go to, as in go to places. I know you've seen this verb before with the future tense. So remember, these two verbs have multiple meanings. Okay, so estar, estoy, estás, está, estamos, están. And we will use the conjugation of this verb to talk about to be at or to be in a place. For example, estar en, and name the place. So if you want to say in Spanish, I am in Indiana, how would you translate that? Same thing here. The students are in the classroom. So that's another thing you can translate. Remember, the verb estar means to be. So I am would probably be yo, and students would be they. Okay? And then for here, we have the verb ir, el verbo ir, and yo voy, tú vas, él va, nosotros, nosotras vamos, ustedes, ellos van. And this means to go to a place. So don't forget that you have to use a. To go to is a. So go ahead and translate these these statements. I go to the park on the weekends. We go to the nightclub on the weekends. You can look at page 178 and 179 for vocabulary practice. And maybe actually some of these words and statements might be in there for vocabulary wise. So go ahead, pause the video, write your answers, and then play when you're ready to check them. All right, so you should be done by at this point, and let's check the answers. I am in Indiana would translate as yo estoy en Indiana. And the students are in the classroom would translate into los estudiantes están en el salón. So again, just make sure that you're using your subject and verb structure and that you are conjugating or using the conjugated form of the verb correctly. So let's go here and look at ir a, which means to go to in terms of places. So in English, I go to the park on the weekends. In Spanish, this is yo voy al parque en los fines de semana. So you should have something like this. Again, subject, verb structure, and the conjugated verb. And the second statement is we go to the nightclub on Saturdays. I'm sorry about got. I meant to say we go to the nightclub. So nosotros vamos a la discoteca los sábados. So now you can kind of start creating these type of statements about your everyday life and your habitual activities. Okay, so continuing with the open questions extra step. Now that we covered estar and ir, let's look at this example. Where, donde, are you on Mondays at 7 a.m.? So where is the WH phrase, donde, or word, and then you're still doing a do you, okay? Question, which, you know, the verb to be conjugates in a different way. So are you is estás. And then the rest of the vocabulary on Mondays at 7 a.m. So these are the type of statements that you'll have to answer.